The amount of influence the Left 4 Dead series has had on the gaming genre as a whole is unmistakable. Many years back, a gaming studio by the name of Turtle Rock Studios teamed up with publisher Valve, and the two worked alongside each other to develop Left 4 Dead in 2008. A cooperative zombie shooter whose influence can be felt in titles like World War Z, Deep Rock Galactic, and many more. Turtle Rock then merged with Valve to be known as Valve South, and the studio developed and produced a perfect sequel, Left 4 Dead 2, which still has large numbers of dedicated fans who still keep the game alive. I still remember the day my dad came home with some random zombie shooter by the name Left 4 Dead, and then getting absolutely hooked in the game the following weeks, and being even further wowed by its sequel. Some of the earliest videos on this very channel was me with my garbage Android camcorder recording Left 4 Dead 2 Survival, which the less said, the better.
Of course, stupid tank, and of course he's going after me. I don't even know where he is. Let me get uphill. The high ground.
The point I'm trying to get across is I was in love with Left 4 Dead, and some of the happiest moments of my time on the Xbox derived from that and the glory days of Black Ops 2, of course. However, a question began brewing in my mind. A question I soon learned was not an uncommon one to ask in the slightest. Where was Left 4 Dead 3? It had been 5 years since Left 4 Dead 2's launch when I became a fan of the series, so where was this third game? Well, there existed 3 theories as to why this immensely popular duology was left on hold. 1. Valve's stubbornness to not release a third sequel to any of their properties. 2. Valve is simply uninterested in making a third game, a sentiment they seem to have expressed in 2020. And lastly, the original minds of the series, Valve South, has split apart from their former company and renamed themselves back to Turtle Rock. The ambitious studio set its eyes on a new IP, Evolve, which was a PvP monster hunting experience. Sadly, however, the game suffered from an abysmal small player base and was deemed a failure after a few months on life support, despite the game's generally good reception. With Valve no longer interested in Left 4 Dead and Turtle Rock unable to make a third game if they wanted due to Valve retaining the rights to the series, all hope seemed lost for the Left 4 Dead community. At least, that was the case until 2020's Game Awards.
Back for blood, and I'm now joined by Chris Ashton of Turtle Rock Studios. This is pretty exciting for all us Left 4 Dead fans. Of course, you guys are known for all the amazing work.
That's right. Left 4 Dead was back, but in an entirely new form and an entirely new IP. A spiritual successor titled Back 4 Blood. My hype surrounding this game was through the roof. I mean, it isn't Left 4 Dead 3, but that doesn't matter. As long as it could fill the gaping hole Valve and Turtle Rock left in my heart, then this was, by all means, the game I waited 6 years for. A super small number compared to those who have been here since the original game's launch. Despite my excitement, Back 4 Blood had to wait while I was busy completing my digital PlayStation library of Resident Evil games. I didn't own this highly anticipated title until my 19th birthday on July 22nd, 2022. A long time after the game's launch on October 12th, 2021. I've just recently platinumed the game on PS5 and tried out the 2 expansions that have been released so far, so I think I've tried out the majority of what it has to offer. Now, the question remains, is Back 4 Blood the Left 4 Dead 3 we've all been waiting for? Or is it a shell of its parent franchise only using the Left 4 Dead name to get people interested? Well, I think you'd be surprised to find out that the answer is a little complicated, so let's not waste any more time. Sit back and relax as we take a close look at Back 4 Blood. Now, one thing you should know off the bat is there will be a plethora of comparisons between Left 4 Dead and Back 4 Blood. Not only is the latter a spiritual successor that keeps the former's gameplay philosophy, but since the games are so similar, comparisons between the two can be helpful in seeing what Back 4 Blood was going for, and also what they decided to change and adapt. Back 4 Blood, like the 2 games that came before it, is a 4-player team-based zombie FPS that requires you and your team to work together to survive the constant onslaught of undead hordes. Not only has the premise been left unaltered, but so has the objective. You and your team start out in a safe room at the beginning of each level, and the main goal is to leave that room and battle through a linear level until you reach the safe room at the end of the level. Basically, get from point A to point B and stay alive while doing so. Along the way, you're attacked by hundreds, if not thousands of zombies, or in this case, ridden, with the main enjoyment of the game coming from the pure chaos unfolding around you. Now, it's very easy to see how this could get very repetitive, but the thing that makes this experience so engaging is the AI director. Basically, an adaptive RNG randomizer that ensures each playthrough feels different from the last. This includes different weapon placements, enemy placements, and even a very subtle form of adaptive difficulty that ensures the player is constantly engaged. So, right off the bat, I want to say this. Hate or love Back 4 Blood, but when it comes to carrying over the fundamental ingredients that made Left 4 Dead so unique and unlike anything anyone had ever played, I think this game succeeds. This isn't me saying the game reaches the same height as Turtle Rock and Valve's former masterpieces, but when it comes to so much as replicating the same feeling of Left 4 Dead, which is already a hard feat to pull off on its own, Back 4 Blood nails it. Also, I was unsure of where to put this, but I should also add the game feels very good to play with smooth controls all around. However, that's just the base gameplay of this brand new zombie slaying experience. There are a lot of new things Turtle Rock brings to the table that not only makes this game stand out on its own, but also aims to satisfy the expectations a modern day gamer would have in terms of replayability. After all, this isn't 2009 anymore. Games nowadays require much more content and complexity within their systems to be worth the time of most players. So now comes the bulk of the video. What innovations to such a simple formula does Back 4 Blood make, and are those innovations welcome or unwarranted? Well, we have a lot to talk about, with the biggest innovation being the new card system. Through a currency card supply points that you can earn in a variety of ways, mostly by completing levels, you can purchase permanent upgrades and or abilities in the form of cards. These cards can be anything from simple stat increases to niche abilities that can benefit a specific build. There's a huge selection of cards you can obtain and choose from, but you're only allowed 15 per deck. When you load into a new campaign, you can choose your deck comprised of the 15 cards you've selected, and can use your unique build to gain a favorable advantage against the ridden. Guys, this system is amazing. I don't think I can put into words just how much depth this adds to the game. First off, this is a system that practically demands replayability. Whether you're playing the game to earn supply points, to purchase new cards, or to try out new decks that fit your specific playstyle, this adds so much to the experience. You're probably wondering why people don't just immediately purchase the crutch cards of the game and use them off the gate. Well, that's because 1. The cards you buy are randomly generated in supply lines that you have to clear out before a new one opens. This can be frustrating if the game outright refuses to make a card you really want made available to you, but I think this can be seen as a good thing since it encourages the player to make do with the cards they do have and experiment with different playstyles instead of defaulting to whatever the meta is. And second, there's really no such thing as crutch cards. Don't get me wrong, some are better than others, but most just offer a tiny buff or ability that can be used as part of larger builds. For example, since I play Doc when I'm with my friends, and I tend to be the medic of the team, my deck is filled with healing cards that when combined together, make me an efficient healer on the field as a trade-off for cards that could alternatively give me a significant damage increase. Usually, those cards are used by the more offensive players in my squad. This card system is fantastic, and like I just mentioned, you can use it in correlation with your character who has a passive ability. I didn't stutter, each of the 11 cleaners currently available at the time of this video's release has a passive ability and a team effect. For example, Doc can heal every teammate for 25 health per level and has team trauma resistance, making her ideal for medic players. Harley can recover 1 health per kill and gives the team a stamina increase, making her perfect for offensive players, particularly those interested in a melee build, so on. This makes the characters you play as matter much more than they ever have, and you're encouraged by the huge selection to try out different ones and build corresponding decks. Already, there is just so much complexity in this game never seen in Left 4 Dead, and this can work as a double-bladed sword. The main appeal behind Left 4 Dead was its general simplicity, and how it was easy for anyone to jump into. While I can see the nuance of Back 4 Blood turning off those who enjoy that simplistic nature, that just simply isn't the type of game Back 4 Blood is trying to be. It's fusing the addictive, chaotic format of the Left 4 Dead games with elements seen in most modern day games, and I think it works really well. But of course, that's not all the new innovation the game has up its sleeve. Introducing corruption cards. These are completely randomized curveballs the game will throw at you and your team at the beginning of every level. These corruption cards can come in many different forms. Half of the ridden will become corrosive and dissolve in acid when killed, a boss encounter that will pin you against one of the game's 3 bosses, challenges that require your team to work together on, or even environmental ones like the absence of any power or a thick heavy fog that's hard to see through. I view these corruption cards as the RNG that made the levels of Left 4 Dead so varied and replayable put on steroids. I don't know how else to describe it. If the AI director wasn't enough, these corruption cards elevate the game's gameplay variety to a whole new level, with each repeat playthrough offering new challenges that shake up the terrain you'll be traversing. It's not even just the individual corruption cards, but rather the combination of some of them that can make for a really interesting experience. I don't care how much you love Left 4 Dead, to say this game has less variety in its gameplay would be complete blasphemy. The combination of character abilities, potential decks comprised of a multitude of cards that can serve different playstyles, and corruption cards that have the potential to entirely morph the way a level plays, makes this game have infinite reasons to replay it constantly, and I can definitely say the game always feels super fresh. With the biggest innovation out of the way, I think it's time to tackle something smaller yet highly integral to the gameplay experience. The mutated Ridden. In Left 4 Dead, it's impossible to forget about the numerous types of special infected that lurk around every corner. These nightmares made working together more imperative than ever, since they each required a great deal of teamwork to defeat. And here it's no different, with 11 variants of mutated Ridden in the base game, and that's not counting bosses. The first and most basic of which are the sleepers, Ridden who are bounded to walls as well as nearby structures. Much like the hunters from Left 4 Dead, these pesky creatures will pin you to the ground and start mauling you until it's killed by a teammate, with the only difference being sleepers will remain dormant until a survivor passes their line of sight. On the bright side, this enemy type encourages the player to remain vigilant of their surroundings and can get a good scare out of them. However, I found these guys to get a teensy bit annoying after a while, mostly due to the rapid spawn rates, especially on higher difficulties. Next up is the Snitch, a wandering passive Ridden that when disturbed will alert a horde. These things used to get under my skin at first, but now I find them to be a great addition to the game. Whether or not they bring an army of pissed off Ridden to your location solely depends on the player's actions and whether they choose to prioritize them before they have a chance to ring the dinner bell. I should also mention that there's a corruption card that can make these snitches instantly alert a horde if killed, and while a little BS, it can unexpectedly lead to some fun, tense stealth segments. Switching over to the Ridden, who have multiple variants, first are the Tall Boys. Towering monsters with club-like arms whose main goal in life is to beat the ever-living shit out of you. What makes this variant so dangerous is its general speed and ability to charge at cleaners. Yeah, they can be a little tricky. Then there are the Bruiser variants. Basically Tall Boys, except much slower in terms of speed, but beefier in terms of health. Another variant is the Crushers, who grab a cleaner in place and squeeze the life out of them until interrupted by the aid of a teammate. These Ridden are no joke. Until you realize that as long as you're strafing at the right time, they cannot grab you. The next major enemy type is Stingers. Acrobatic, fast Ridden who can spit acid at you. Basically a spitter from Left 4 Dead with the agility of a hunter. The most dangerous variant of Stingers are the Stalkers. Ridden who will latch onto a cleaner and not only strangle them, but drag them away from their team. During moments of downtime, a rescue is totally plausible, but when shit really hits the fan and there's total chaos, these sneaky enemies can completely separate you from your team and provide nearby combat Ridden with a nice punching bag. The other variant is a Hawker, who's super similar to the Stinger, except the goo it spits out will pin a cleaner in place until they're meleeed out of it by their teammates. The fourth of the mutated Ridden is Reekers. Giant Ridden who, when shot, will cover whoever is nearby in guts that will alert a horde. I personally love this variation since it requires a team of players to coordinate when to dispose of the bothersome Reeker, since blindly killing it can result in bad consequences. Its less exciting variant is the Wretch. The same creature except it vomits acidic waste onto you, and its explosion doesn't attract a horde. Despite my hate for projectile enemies in video games, both the Hawker and Stingers are moderately fun to go against. But Wretches are just annoying and can unfairly lead to a lot of punishing damage if it catches you and your team off guard while you're closely packed together. Lastly are the Exploders, whose names should be very self-explanatory. They're basically the Reekers, except they have the ability to self-detonate, and their explosion serves to damage instead of calling a herd. Like Reekers, they take some heavy consideration before dispatching, and they can add some nice variety. But those are just the regular mutations. Next up, we have boss mutations. Sparingly used boss encounters that can really shake up a level. Starting off with the smallest and easiest of which, we have the Hag. What I love about this creature is it's obvious it's this game's version of the Witch from Left 4 Dead, yet there are enough changes made to make it original in numerous ways. Like the formerly mentioned Nightmare Fuel, this Nightmare Fuel is a passive Ridden who will only lash out when disturbed. Once triggered, it will target the cleaner who pissed it off and start swallowing them whole. If not interrupted, it basically insta-kills the player in dip. What's exclusive only to the Hag is 1. Its monstrous, grotesque design, 2. It reacts to nearby gunshots and will follow your team until you're completely silent, and 3. It doesn't let up. If it takes significant damage, it'll leave temporarily, only to reappear later in the level of a vengeance. I think the Hag is a pretty solid boss who, unlike the others, can add some genuine horror in the midst of this experience. A complete contrast to such a tactical boss is the Breaker, a giant hulking Ridden who'll get in your face and smash it shortly afterward. These boss encounters tend to be really straightforward, but that's what I like about them. Just a simple, giant creature you and your team have to take out in a brutal, tight showdown. Oh, and don't think you can run super far away and snipe these breakers. A tight circle of ridden insects spawns around the location of each breaker you encounter, forcefully enclosing all 4 cleaners in a tight battle with this monstrous opponent. Speaking of monstrous, let's talk about the ogres. Giant, towering ridden who can pose a huge threat to you and your team of its humongous size. Every time one of these spawn in, I'm instantly smacked with a feeling of dread since they don't go down easy. I absolutely love this huge sense of scale Turtle Rock went for, but unfortunately there are a few downsides. 1, the ogre's pathfinding can be super buggy or at times even easily manipulated by an experienced player, and 2, it can sometimes be super easy to cheese this thing. It obviously cannot fit in most interiors, so what you can do is run inside a house that has a good view of its weak spots and shoot at them worry free. Granted, sometimes the ogre is intelligent enough to either launch a well-positioned projectile or disengage from the encounter altogether until the players leave their shelter, but sometimes they aren't. Now that I've hopefully done a good enough job of explaining this game's array of systems and enemies, I can delve a little deeper into how the game feels from a cleaner's point of view. How does Back 4 Blood really play? Well, I think a good place to start is gunplay. As you might expect, Back 4 Blood features a huge variety of weapons, the primary ones consisting of assault rifles, SMGs, shotguns, LMGs, and sniper rifles, and secondary ones which include sidearms and melee weapons. I just want to immediately state that each of these weapons feel great when it comes to handling. Despite the large arsenal, each of these weapons have a distinct feeling to them and can vary in utility from playstyle to playstyle. And if your controller has current gen haptic feedback, especially if you're using a DualSense, each of the weapon's gunfire and kickback physically feel distinct in your hands. But if a weapon has too much feedback for your liking or not carrying as much ammo as you had hoped, fear not, because another addition of Back 4 Blood are weapon attachments. Barrels, optics, stocks, you name it. This way, your weapon's full potential is rarely reached, and this gives you a nice incentive to both explore and keep a healthy amount of copper on you. Holy shit, I haven't even touched on copper yet. Copper is a form of in-game currency that you can acquire when playing levels. While supply points are spent on supply lines, copper is used to gain an in-game advantage to purchase things like attachments, ammunitions, weapons, team stat upgrades, or accessories. Copper is not only a good reward for exploration, but it's also a good incentive to complete side quests that often come in the form of corruption cards. I just wish the currency was a little more plentiful, since every item inside the vendor, the place where you purchase all the aforementioned things, can be a bit too pricey. Another huge part of this game is its introduction of rarities, a common element of most modern day games. Rarities are basically better variants of existing standard items which all fall under the common rarity. Then of course there's uncommon, rare, and lastly epic, which has your gun performing at its max potential. Even more so if you have legendary attachments to go along with it. Everything concerning gunplay is fantastic, but since we covered things on the offensive side, what about defensive? Well, that's when things get complicated. Let me introduce you to a little thing called trauma. No, not that kind. A permanent lowering of your max health that can be caused by excessive damage. In a game where you're going against hordes and hordes of zombies. What? Look, I'm all for punishing the player if they mindlessly rush into danger or take too many engagements, but this is a chaotic zombie shooter, not a Resident Evil game. Taking damage in this game might as well be guaranteed, so punishing players for something quite literally out of their control 95% of the time is such a weird decision. There are ways to counteract it though and regain your health, such as medkits, recovery stations, and intermediate saving periods. However, these are rarely enough to accommodate for the usual amount of trauma received, so if there aren't defensive cards in your deck that can provide trauma resistance, this mechanic can really get under your nerves since it's completely unavoidable. Also, if you think you can simply run away from the undead, receiving damage slows you down astronomically, so fleeing from encounters is practically impossible, something you really notice in higher difficulties. While we're on the subject of things I don't like, hazards. Hazards are things within the level that you can trigger by mistakes which will bring a horde of ridden to you. Look, I don't hate the idea of hazards. I loved them in the Left 4 Dead game since it kept players on edge and punished them for reckless mistakes. I love them here as well, but Back 4 Blood's problem is there's way too many of them. You can trigger car alarms, security door alarms, startle one of the numerous flock of crows around, get covered in weaker guards, start a mandatory loud mechanism, have an ogre or breaker spawn in, and don't forget about snitches. You can't so much as blink twice in this game without triggering an army of Ridden, and it just becomes an annoyance after a while. It's not a major issue, but it's still worth mentioning. Back to your arsenal, I think I should also briefly touch on the many accessories you have at your disposal. There are offensive ones like frag grenades and pipe bombs that can either draw away a horde or do significant damage to mutations, support types that encompass all types of heals, and quick accessories that can come in the form of razor wire, defibrillators, and ammo pouches. These accessories are another addition to the many tools you have for survival, and like weapons and attachments, they all vary in rarity as well. So yeah, that's the last of Back 4 Blood's major innovations, and if you've been paying attention thus far, you shouldn't need me to tell you that this game has so many levels to its gameplay. While there is a learning curve when you first get into it, you'll soon find yourself having a blast with its layers of weaponry, enemy types, and customization. As you might have noticed, this review has been mostly positive, and that's because I think this is a kick-ass game. But when it comes to balancing, well, this is one of Back 4 Blood's elements that they don't really nail, to say the least. Back 4 Blood has 4 difficulties to choose from: Recruit, Veteran, Nightmare, and No Hope. Recruit is about what you'd expect. You practically breeze through all levels and you have to try to get yourself killed. Veteran is this game's normal mode for players who want a fair challenge. This difficulty matters the most since it's the experience the devs intended for you, and it's pretty balanced for the most part. Sure, sometimes certain corruption card combinations as well as mutation spawns can lead to some brutally impossible situations, but then again, that's always been a thing of Left 4 Dead's gameplay style, and with its unpredictable RNG nature, I don't see how it could be prevented. Overall, Veteran gave me a fun challenge and is definitely the difficulty I'd recommend. However, if you're brand new, consider giving a Recruit a try beforehand. However, if you happen to be a masochist or a desperate fuck like me who want this game's platinum trophy, brace yourselves for Nightmare. I want you to take all of the issues I mentioned before, like trauma and too many hazards, and ramp it up by 100 along with Ridden spawns. There is no such thing as downtime in Nightmare. You are constantly up to your knees in zombies and mutations to happen to deal significantly punishing damage. Nightmare is kind of fucking broken to the point where it is one step away from unplayable, and you can forget about any sort of progression if you go in without a proper deck of cards. You will die. Those of you who played Left 4 Dead's Expert Mode might bask in fond memories of trial and error since you had infinite retries. Don't get me wrong, Expert Mode in Left 4 Dead was impossible, but Back 4 Blood's ramped up difficulty becomes instantly unappetizing once you consider the live system. I haven't gone into it yet, but Back 4 Blood gives you a certain number of chances to complete a chapter, which belongs to one of 4 acts in the game. If your team gets wiped, you only have a certain number of chances depending on your difficulty before all of you get sent back to your most recent checkpoint. On Nightmare, you get 1 life, and each checkpoint is at the beginning of every chapter, meaning if you fail twice, it is back to square one. This can be really frustrating since there's really no point in this feature at all, and it only serves to erase you and your team's well-earned progression. There were too many times where I had good Nightmare runs, but because me and my ragtag team of AI would get bodied by the unfair mutation spawn rates, I got sent all the way back. And No Hope is even worse since it doesn't give you any lives, buffs up friendly damage, and it has no safe room health restoration. Thank God I was not required to beat it. Since we're on difficulty, this is a great time to mention the elephant in the room. I wasn't there, but apparently on this game's launch, difficulty scaling was off the charts and even playing on Recruit was super challenging. Now, this has mostly no relevance to the video since I'm covering this game in its current state as of September 2022, but I thought it was worth pointing out just how far Turtle Rock has come from its reportedly disastrous launch. However, Nightmare is a permanent reminder on how this game's balancing has serious issues at times. To end the section on a more positive note, you earn more supply points in the higher difficulties you play, and I just think that's a really good incentive for more experienced players to test themselves a little bit. So, with all of Back 4 Blood's base content covered, you might be wondering what else is there to talk about. Well, not so fast, because don't forget Back 4 Blood has a story beneath its chaotic action, and I'm one of the few people out there who semi-care about it. So let's get into Back 4 Blood's narrative offerings. The background to this game is simple enough. After a group of scientists in Antarctica unearths a dormant species named the devil worm, the species is revitalized after exposure to water. One by one, this parasitic species takes over a plethora of human hosts now known as Ridden, and they increase their numbers globally, turning the world into a post-apocalyptic battle between those who choose to fight, known as cleaners, and the never-ending hordes of monsters. I have to give Turtle Rock credit, this is a very cool approach to a formula that's been done time and time again. Instead of having a story that tells the same old scenario that involves a world-ending virus and a group of unrelated survivors banding together with no additional aid, Back 4 Blood brings a fresh spin to things with a parasitic species going against an organized militaristic group. It's a pretty sick concept, and while I'm on the subject, I want to highlight just how cool of a threat the Ridden are. While the Devil Worms' mutated hosts not only qualify as an infection in their own right, but also as far as environments are concerned. All throughout the game, you see Ridden hives made of human remains that swallow up the nearby buildings and terrain. What's left of the human race is a tug-of-war with the Ridden over the earth as we know it, and it really does make our fight against the undead feel impossible. Also, the abandoned, war-torn buildings around them serve as our cleaners' only reminder of a once safe, peaceful time with their dusty, empty interiors. The cleaners in question consist of 8 individuals who are immune to whatever's going on since the Devil Worm has no interest in using them as hosts. There's Walker, a former experienced veteran who's battle-hardened and relentless, and he and his allies fight against the Ridden. I love the concept of Walker, and he does occasionally have some cool moments, but he unfortunately falls on the blender side. Doc is a definite improvement. Being a no-nonsense experienced doctor, Doc serves as the rationale of the group, but is also not without her cheeky moments and comedic bits. Undoubtedly, one of the best characters in the game is Mom, a complete and utter badass who's a natural-born leader by heart, especially since the death of her son. Her tragic background has turned her into a stone-cold, unstoppable soldier who has still found herself being the backbone of the group because of her warm kindness towards her new family. A family she's initially reluctant to accept at first. All in all, Mom is just a cool character who grew on me the more I played the game. But someone who didn't have to grow on me at all is Hoffman, my favorite character. Hoffman is quite literally just a nutball conspiracy theorist who seems to be into this zombie apocalypse thing a little too much. Despite his eccentric nature, Hoffman still cares a great deal for his fellow cleaners and is another strong addition to the group. What can I say, he's a fun character. Speaking of fun, let's not forget about Holly, a laid-back college student who's mainly the comedic relief. Holly is another vital addition to the team and keeps everyone together with her pure resilience to the apocalypse. She's fun to be around, but just as useful. Another great cleaner is Invengelo, the youngest and least experienced out of everybody, but easily the most innocent and loyal. Invengelo is definitely in my top 3 along with Holly and Hoffman because of just how fun his dialogue is. Being the least experienced, he's easily the most nervous and will likely reflect a lot of the thoughts a player feels when shit hits the fan. He's also too innocent and pure for this world. Next up is Carly, who definitely has the most interesting dynamic of the other 7. Carly is a loner through and through because of her standoffish and quite frankly rude behavior that derives from not trusting anyone. However, with the Ridden on the rise, she reluctantly bands together with the others as an unofficial cleaner. Though Carly is the least friendly of the group, she more than makes up for that on the field. I think Carly is a really cool character in concept, but like Walker, I don't think enough is done of her. Though she's definitely an improvement over Jim, who's a complete blank slate and only character trait is the fact that he's from the country. That wraps it up for all 8 cleaners in the base game, and I just gotta say, the writers crafted a pretty good group of characters overall. They all have their distinct personalities and specific roles within the group. And as a side note, I also love how diverse the overall team is. It goes without saying that representation in media matters a lot to those in marginalized groups, and I commend Turtle Rock for having an equal amount of male and female characters who vary in ethnic background. My only complaint about our team of cleaners is the fact that since they all can't be in a match at once with this being a 4-player game and all, they feel like less of a team than the Left 4 Dead crews that came before. Still, Back 4 Blood did great with its characterization. The actual story begins with our cleaners arriving at a town in Finleyville called Evansburg to start trading supplies when suddenly, an unprecedented number of Ridden invade the peaceful town in what our characters recognize as a resurgence of Ridden. They shoot their way through the now overrun town and take drastic measures to stop the Ridden advances by blowing up George Washington Bridge. However, all is not good back at Fort Hope where the Ridden resurgence has reached the stronghold's gate and is barely just kept at bay by our cleaners, with the main question looming over everyone's head. Where did this sudden increase in Ridden activity come from? The most we get towards an explanation are a bunch of mines where the monsters are coming from, which our cleaners closed off, which concludes Act 1. Unfortunately, Act 2 is actually nothing but filler narrative-wise. It mostly involves our group securing supplies for General Phillips. Oh yeah, Phillips. General Phillips is the ice-cold, no-nonsense leader of Fort Hope who organizes and plans our operations, but is more than willing to get into the fight himself. In the earlier parts of the game, Phillips is set up to be a cold, emotionless leader who prioritizes the fight over the well-being of his own men, but that doesn't really go anywhere. Kinda a waste. I thought it would have been cool if Phillips gets so caught up in the war against the Ridden, he adopted more of an antagonistic role, making Mom take over Fort Hope. Oh well. Anyways, the only thing of note in Act 2 is when the characters see what looks like an earthquake that has ravaged their nearby surroundings, which is obvious setup for something big. Act 2 concludes with our cleaners learning of someone of interest, Dr. Rogers, who they have to escort back to Fort Hope. They meet up with an outpost where we get this really awkward cutscene.
Appreciate the assist there.
Glad we could help.
But you weren't just in the neighborhood.
You know it.
What? Anyways, the group make their way to Dr. Rogers, who is voiced by Tony Todd? Okay. Anyways, this is where the story really gets interesting. You see, Dr. Rogers is a scientist who has developed a way to combat the Ridden via a new chemical compound. His creation, the T5 gas, humanity's greatest and final chance to win the losing war. Dr. Rogers is escorted to safety along with his research, and the cleaners go to get the rest of it at an old quarantine center when they discover something admittedly pretty freaking cool. A mass grave that was the result of repeated body dumping once the dead at the quarantine center became too full. This huge collection of bodies provided the devil worms a perfect breeding ground for a hive, and it's here where the resurgence began. In this massive ridden hive that cleaners are tasked with destroying by using the newly developed T5. They accomplish this task, and the future seems bright until a sudden aggravated horde flood Fort Hope, and this happens. Meet the Abomination. Now, there is literally no confirmation on what this creature is, but it can be reasonably inferred it's a rare, ginormous Ridden mutation that came from the massive hive that characters just dispatched, which is why it has chosen now to attack Fort Hope. I personally think this creature was the one responsible for the massive amount of destruction seen in Act 2, but I can't say for sure. Regardless of what it is, it's sure as hell a threat that needs to be taken care of immediately, and the cleaners attempt to do so using T5. But as the battle begins, the helicopter gets taken out by an ogre, resulting in a crash that kills Dr. Rogers. With General Phillips injured on the field and no T5 formula left, it's up to our cleaners to take on the monster in an admittedly underwhelming boss fight. I get it, Turtle Rock probably didn't have the budget to create a proper final ending fight, but if Vanguard zombies can pull it off, then who knows at this point. Anyways, the story ends with our 8 cleaners just barely destroying the Abomination. Afterward, we end off with a little bit of optimism as Walker inspires everyone to keep fighting before they all quite literally walk into the sunrise. A cheesy ending for sure, but one that fits the overall cheesy vibe of Back 4 Blood. However, this ending isn't perfect, since the last 2 acts feel pretty pointless now. The one weapon that could eliminate the threat of the Ridden is gone, and the person who made it is dead. I get if they solved the threat of the Ridden this early, it would make future expansions as well as a potential sequel impossible, but aside from surviving the resurgence, nothing really happened. Overall, Back 4 Blood's story is pretty decent. For a game that greatly emphasizes gameplay over narrative, the background lore, characters, and occasional cool plot beats makes Back 4 Blood's story hit just right for the few players like me who are interested. Most of it is environmental or hidden within the subtext of character dialogue, but those who care can learn to love and appreciate it. I just wish there were more cutscenes showing our team interacting since, like I said earlier, it feels very fragmented since they are rarely on screen at the same time. Still, a pretty good narrative. Well everyone, I think we've reached the end. I know, what about the expansions? This is a live service game after all, and both Expansion 1, Tunnels of Terror, and Expansion 2, Children of the Worm, have released, and I happen to own both of them. Well, after some thought, I decided not to go over them in this video since the confirmed Expansion 3 has yet to be released. It'd be weird talking about 2/3 of the game's post-launch content, so I've decided that this video will strictly cover base game content only. As for the expansions, I'm going to cover them in a follow-up video that will serve as a brief part 2 if you will, which if you're watching after the release of Expansion 3 can be found in the description. For any of you who are thinking of getting into doing reviews or video essays in the future, know that discussing live service games is a bitch. In conclusion, Back 4 Blood is far from the game I expected it to be back when I saw its reveal at the Game Awards. I expected typical Left 4 Dead action of new campaigns that only utilized next-gen technology for visuals alone. Instead, what I got was a game that wasn't scared to reach for the stars. A game that tried so many new things all in one package while still retaining the style of gameplay that made Left 4 Dead so fun. Unfortunately, I think all the Left 4 Dead marketing really hurt this game's success since it does not in the slightest function as a sequel or a proper follow-up. But what makes Back 4 Blood so awesome isn't Left 4 Dead. It's Back 4 Blood. It's the endless variety, replayability, great visuals, and intriguing narrative this game has tied with its familiar cooperative zombie action we all know and love that makes Back 4 Blood a bloody good time.